Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the second in a series of programs I'm doing on Ralph Waldo Emerson, arguably the greatest wisdom writer in the history of the United States. And what is a wisdom writer? Well, a wisdom writer is someone who stimulates our thinking about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. Also, a wisdom writer helps us to understand ourselves and life at a much deeper level. Allow me a brief review of some of the comments I made in my first program on Emerson. I pointed out that he was born in 1803 in Boston, Massachusetts, and that he lived most of his life in Concord, Massachusetts, a place renowned for producing provocative writers and thinkers, including Emerson's best friend, Henry David Thoreau. Emerson was a very sincere, courageous man who often said and wrote things that caused him to be disliked by more than a few people. Being popular was not one of Emerson's values. Indeed, Emerson believed that if one strove to be a popular person, one would almost inevitably have to sacrifice some of one's integrity to achieve popularity. Perhaps the most quoted line from Emerson's works is this: "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." And what are some examples of Emerson's nonconformity? Well, I mentioned in my last program on him that 15 years before Lincoln was elected to the presidency, Emerson was making fiery speeches calling for the abolition of slavery. And I must add, at that time it was dangerous to do so. Many Americans, including many Northerners, felt it was better not to talk very much about slavery, not to rock the boat, so to speak. Emerson also was a nonconformist in terms of his religious and spiritual life. Emerson had been an ordained Protestant minister from the age of 26 to age 31, when he left the ministry to embark on a new career as a writer and lecturer. Despite the fact that Emerson always remained a very spiritual person, he did become a serious critic of organized religion. And I will be doing a future program on Emerson and his views about religion, because I think that whether you agree with them or not, they are provocative. They do stimulate our thinking about religion, especially organized religion. Emerson died at the age of 78 in Concord, Massachusetts, and by the time he died, he had become a very famous person in both the United States and Europe. Emerson is regarded as one of the great essayists in the Western tradition. The general theme of his essays is what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. If you are interested in reading his essays, it's very easy to obtain collections of them. If you go to any Barnes & Noble store or any really good bookstore, it's very likely that they will have books, again, which are collections of his essays, also with some biographical material about him. If you're interested in reading a great biography of Emerson, I highly recommend a book by Professor Robert Richardson, Jr., entitled Emerson, The Mind on Fire. Again, the title of a great biography of Emerson is entitled Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Mind on Fire. I highly recommend it. Emerson addresses himself to the question, what are the purposes of human life? Why are we here? What are we supposed to do with our lives? And his answer is the following, and it involves several major points. Emerson believed that one of the purposes of life is to acquire more self-knowledge. Emerson attached a lot of importance to the ancient Greek maxim, know thyself. Emerson believed it was very important that each of us engage in an ongoing exploration of self, and that we examine what's positive and also what's negative in ourselves, and try to become better human beings. Emerson also believed that another purpose of life, and this is very much connected with acquiring more self-knowledge, another important purpose of life is self-cultivation, self-development. And what did Emerson mean by that? Well, he meant that we must study, we must search for what makes life a fulfilling experience, and once we determine what makes life a fulfilling experience, to implement those ideas, those behaviors in our everyday lives. Emerson believed that our chief purpose in life, in terms of self-cultivation, self-development, is to become a very good human being. Emerson believed that wisdom is never divorced from goodness. Wisdom is never divorced from goodness. Emerson believed a wise person must be a good person. Emerson contended that it's impossible for one to be both wise and not a decent human being. How do we learn? How do we learn to live a more fulfilling life? Well, according to Emerson, in fact, specifically, let me backtrack for a second. Again, what must we do to live a more fulfilling life? Well, in other words, how do we acquire more self-knowledge and more self-understanding? And also, how do we learn what we should do to engage ourselves in the process of self-cultivation, self-development? Well, Emerson believed we learn in many ways. Among the ways we learn are the following. We can learn from experience, especially from evaluating our experiences. But I must add that Emerson did not believe that old age is a guarantee of wisdom. Again, Emerson did not believe that old age is a guarantee of wisdom. He believed that some elderly people have wisdom and some don't. And what's the difference between them? Well, the older people who do have wisdom have been good at evaluating their experiences in life so that they're no longer making the same mistakes they made years ago. Whereas an elderly person who has not acquired much wisdom may be making the same mistakes in their 60s, 70s, 80s that they made years ago. In other words, they haven't really learned very much from their life's experiences. Another way in which we can learn is through good books, wisdom books. Also, through very good plays, movies, music. I think there is such a thing as a wisdom play. I know there is such a thing as wisdom theater, wisdom movies, wisdom music. Although I think the works of wisdom in those categories are in the minority of works in those areas. I'm talking specifically, for example, about books, plays, and music that help us to distinguish what is true and false about ourselves, human nature, and life. Again, a wisdom book, a wisdom play, a wisdom movie helps us to distinguish what is true and what is false about ourselves, human nature, and life. They help to wake us up. They help to free us of illusions. Wisdom books, for example, help to free us of illusions. Illusions we may have, for example, about romantic love, about marriage, about social status, about where we should look for joy. So many of the great wisdom writers claim that people have mistaken ideas about where we should look for joy, that most people don't look in the right places for joy, and therefore their lives are never as fulfilling as they could be. Emerson, on the subject of books, said this, and I'm quoting him, "In the highest civilization, the book is still the highest delight. He who has once known its satisfactions is provided with a resource against calamity." Again, he's talking about wisdom books, and he who has once known the satisfactions of reading wisdom books is provided with a resource against calamity. Emerson believed that besides learning from experience and good books and plays, we can also learn from wise people. It's likely that all of us know some wise people. Could be a teacher, a professor, a relative, a friend, a neighbor, a clergy person. Emerson also believed, and this is extremely important in terms of understanding Emerson, he also believed we learn by intuition. Emerson believed that we learn not only through reason and critical thinking, which are very important, but also by intuition. And what did he mean? What did Emerson mean by intuition? Well, by intuition, he means our inner voice. He also uses the expression, our inner light. To listen to our inner voice, according to Emerson, to listen to our inner voice, to hear our inner voice, generally requires solitude and silence, that it's highly unlikely that one will hear very much of one's inner voice if one doesn't experience a lot of solitude and a lot of silence. Solitude and silence on a daily basis. So many of the spiritual thinkers in history have said similar things. Emerson and his best friend, Henry David Thoreau, are both referred to as transcendentalists. If you were to pick up a philosophy book or some other book of famous thinkers in which Emerson and Thoreau are included, again, they're usually referred to as transcendentalists. And what does that mean? Well, Emerson defined transcendentalism in this way. He said that transcendentalism is the capacity of knowing truth intuitively. Transcendentalism is the capacity for knowing truth intuitively. We have a way of learning the truth in a way which transcends the senses. Again, we have a way of accessing truth in a way that transcends the senses. Emerson believed we learn with our hearts as well as with our minds. In fact, Emerson said this about people with great hearts, and I'm quoting him. "The distinction of a royal nature is a great heart." Again, the distinction of a royal nature, of an outstanding nature, is a great heart. This reminds me of something the famous writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge said, and I think he provides illumination for what Emerson is talking about. Coleridge said this, and I'm quoting him. He said, "I believe that deep thinking is attainable only by a person of deep feeling. Deep thinking is attainable only by a person of deep feelings." Jacques Rousseau, another famous intellectual, agreed with both Emerson and Coleridge. Rousseau very much believed in using reason to discover truth in life, but he believed that reason was not sufficient. He believed that reason is important, but that the cold light of reason needs the warmth of the heart to inspire action, goodness, and virtue. Again, we need reason in conjunction with the warmth of the heart to do our best thinking. Rousseau, like Emerson, also believed that reason is not enough to make us moral persons, that in order to be very decent, very kind, for example, it's very important, essential, that we have good hearts, that we cultivate a good heart. The idea is that empathy and compassion can be great motivators. Empathy and compassion can be great motivators. Emerson believed that one should be very reluctant to trust an intellectual, a scholar who is lacking empathy and compassion. Emerson, I mentioned, was a nonconformist, and while he often criticized some ministers, he also criticized many professors. Emerson, by the way, had 2 degrees from Harvard University. Emerson believed that some of the professors and other intellectuals who may not have been professors were all mind and no feeling. All mind and no feeling. In recent times, I think so many of the Nazis in Germany fit that category. Some of the Nazis were very well-educated people in a certain sense, had certain outstanding academic credentials, but were lacking good hearts. Also, I think it's fair to say that there are professors in all countries of the world, hopefully a minority, and I think they are in the minority, again, who are all mind and no feeling. And maybe that's the reason so many of them are so inadequate in the classroom, that they can't relate very well to people. They might be able to write scholarly articles, but when it comes to teaching, interacting with young people, for example, in a college classroom, because of their lack of empathy, their lack of compassion, they just can't be good teachers, good professors. Scholar Houston Smith, one of America's outstanding professors and America's expert on comparative religion, he also has talked about the importance of the heart in trying to discover what's really true in life. And he said this, again, this is Professor Houston Smith: unless our hearts prompt us to cooperate, reason will devise clever strategies to promote self-interest. So again, Smith is saying, if we just use reason in the absence of a good heart, reason may simply promote self-interest. Another very famous spiritual teacher, and I suspect many of you who are very interested in spirituality have read some books by this man, Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti, again, one of the most famous spiritual teachers of the 20th century. He stressed the connection between the heart and the mind. In fact, he coined the phrase mind-heart, mind-heart, that he talked about the connection and the essential connection between them if one is going to do one's best thinking in life and if one is going to do one's best living in life. It's very important that we cultivate a connection between our minds and our hearts. Emerson believed that what makes life more satisfying and interesting, is to habitually live to access higher, deeper levels of thought and feeling. I'll say that again. Emerson believed that one of the things that makes life much more interesting and fulfilling is to habitually live in such a way that one is habitually looking to access higher levels of thought and feeling. Emerson believed that life can be very boring, not to say unfulfilling, if we don't make the effort to try to access higher levels of thought and feeling. Emerson believed that the majority of people in any society cannot be trusted to act wisely. Emerson believed that in any society, it's only a minority of people who have wisdom. And therefore, the wise person is one who questions. And among the things the wise person in any society questions, if one wishes to grow intellectually and spiritually, is that one must habitually question the values and the behavior of the majority of people in one society. I'll say that again. Emerson believed that to live a fulfilling life, it was essential that one habitually question the values and the behavior of the majority of people in one's society. And here is a quote from Emerson, which I think very much illustrates this idea of his. He said this: "Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members." Again, society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. And of course, he also said, and this again is probably his most famous quote, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." I would add the word woman also. Whoso would be a man or woman must be a nonconformist. One of the reasons Emerson didn't trust the majority of people to act wisely is that the defining issue of his life was slavery. Slavery was not abolished in the United States until Emerson was 62 years old, which means that for most of his life, slavery was legal and indeed flourished in the United States. Emerson wanted to know, what did it say about the majority of Americans that they consented to allow slavery to flourish for 200 years in a supposedly Christian nation? Another example of Emerson on the lack of wisdom in the majority is the following. Emerson believed that it was not unusual that large numbers of people judged other people by their possessions and not by their morals. Here are Emerson's own words. They, meaning the majority, they measure respect for each other, but by what each has and not by what each is. Again, they measure respect for each other by what each has, not by what each is. I have no doubt that Emerson would agree with Seneca, one of the great thinkers of antiquity and one of Emerson's favorite writers. I have no doubt he would agree with Seneca that when someone enters our homes, they should not admire our furniture, but rather our character. Emerson believed that wise people in all societies question the customs of their society. Emerson went on to say that society does not like to have the existing social order questioned. But he went on to say this, and these are Emerson's own words: "The questioning of custom is an inevitable stage in the growth of every superior mind. An important Emersonian theme is the following: don't let other people do your thinking for you. Don't let other people do your thinking for you. This is one of the most important of Emerson's themes in his essays. Emerson, if he were alive today, would say, don't let the advertising industry do your thinking for you. Don't let the television industry do your thinking for you. Don't even let religious people, clergy, do your thinking for you. Emerson would concede there are wise people among the clergy, but also there are unwise people among the clergy. Isn't it true that in the last year, both Senators McCain and Barack Obama have had to disassociate themselves from certain ministers because of what McCain and Senator Obama perceived as inflammatory and very unwise statements by certain ministers? So again, Emerson would say, don't let others do your thinking for you. This would include your brother-in-law as well, by the way. I'll have much more to say about this in my next program on Emerson, and I did mention in a future program on Emerson, I'm going to zero in on his beliefs about religion. You recall he was an ordained Protestant minister for 5 years. Indeed, graduated from the Harvard University Divinity School. But right now I see I'm running short on time. As is my custom, I would like to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau believed we are all artists. And in his masterpiece, Waldo, he penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.